Hello there, friends. Welcome to another episode of our weekly Bible study podcast. This is episode number something.
It'll be on the screen, right?
I have just been told this is episode number 8.
Ooh, who told him?
Number 8. And we are in Exodus. I'm Scott, lead pastor at First Christian Church of Greenville, Tennessee, fccgreen.org, with the extra E after the N.
Of course.
I'm surprised by how many people
Don't forget that.
the extra E.
It's amazing to me.
Let me tell you, Facebook Marketplace the other day, this guy was not spelling it correctly. He was in Greenville. I'm like, no, this is a scam.
Oof.
He's not really in Greenville.
That's a great start. So,
Thanks, Tyson.
so who are you?
I'm Tommy, and I'm at the Afton campus.
Cool.
Yeah.
And you are?
I'm Tyson at the Greenville campus.
Yes. And we started a mixer. So, our throngs of dozens of listeners can get to know us well.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure they're pining to do.
Yeah.
So it's favorite Bible translation today.
No, we're going to start with Tyson.
Oh, we're starting with Tyson? I thought we were ending with Tyson.
Oh, okay, we'll end with Tyson.
Let's end with
mine's
Tyson.
the Nestle Allen. No, it's not.
Nestle Allen is a Greek text, so Tommy's trying to power up.
Prime the pump for Tyson's joke.
Because it's not a joke. I prefer the Messianic translations where they put the Hebrew in there for the names of God. Because I speak Hebrew, just thought everyone should know.
Oh,
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks, Tyson, for
And by
another
speak
way
Hebrew, what Tyson means is he can read the words and pronounce them.
I can make the sounds.
He can make the sounds.
Sounds.
Hey, that's not nothing, actually, because that vowel pointing stuff is crazy.
And I'm just kidding. Hebrew is beating me up.
It's tough.
It is beating me up.
It's a whole new planet of
And there was a
crazy.
Hebrew word in this that I wanted you to pronounce, so we're going to put you on the spot.
Ooh, that's good.
All right.
Yeah.
Little teaser for the people.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're all excited.
And I like the ESV. I think it's a good mix of readability and accuracy towards the text.
I'm with Thomas. That's my favorite.
I spent years in the NIV.
Yeah.
I spent years in the New King James Version. I've now spent years in the ESV. They're all good. I go back
Sure.
and forth, especially when I'm studying.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I stick right now with the ESV.
Yeah.
I wanted to like the Legacy Standard Bible, which was new, and
Yeah.
just never really took. I found myself being drawn back towards the ESV.
It's a new version of the NASB.
Yeah.
It's good.
Oh, really? I didn't realize it was connected to NASB.
Yeah. ESV is connected to the RSV.
It's mostly
/
copyright
A.
stuff, strangely enough. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Waiting for the copyright to.
Yeah, it was about some of the flexibility that comes with that. And
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And these people watching are like, what are they talking
Oh,
about?
I mean,
they
can
don't
we
even
can we
know.
get to the text,
They don't
people?
Yeah, come on.
Please.
Come on.
Start over.
Please. Your version's great, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're on. We're in Exodus, and we are in chapter 21.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Thomas. Tommy's going to be preaching this here this
I will
coming
be.
Sunday. We're in Exodus 21, 1 through 11. And there's a lot of interesting stuff here to talk about. Starting at verse 1 through 11. Let me read, since I don't think I've read yet.
Yeah,
You
read.
have not.
You read 2 times ago.
Not with me as on the podcast. You have
Oh,
not.
okay. All right. Then
That's true. He wasn't there when you did it.
I can't remember what I ate this morning. 21, 1 through 11. Now, these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife of her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost. And his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. Significant verses 5 and 6 there. We'll come back to all that. 7 through 11. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing, without payment of money. So, let's talk a little context before we get into the specifics here.
Yeah,
First of all, I just want to say this is going to be a little difficult. This is a tough passage talking about slavery.
It's definitely a difficult topic in that sense, yes.
Yeah.
There are some important distinctions to be made between our conceptions of things and what they were doing here. And
Yeah.
It's one of those places, which we come to these a lot, but where we want to immediately impress our own context, which is, interestingly, what we're doing right now is trying to say, what's the context
Yes.
for
Yes.
when it was written?
Then.
And so it's a great opportunity to make that point of what we do in these every week as we're going through. What's
Yeah.
the context that this was written, delivered? That's important for us to do, especially on a time where we might want to rush.
Yeah.
Like this one.
So the literary context, scripturally here, is it's
Mhm.
right on the heels of the Ten Commandments, and this is what begins to be called the Book of the Covenant. Um,
We made
Some
that
people-
transition with the laws about altars.
Mhm.
We made that transition a little bit in the way we talked through that passage. And
yes, and it is a transition passage, and yet some people say it is the beginning of the Book of the Covenant.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm like,
Yeah.
let's just call this that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then what follows, and we'll see the transitional word there in the first verse that we read with rules,
Yeah.
which is the Hebrew word I want you to read, Tyson. So in your Hebrew Bible over there, pronounce that word for rules.
I don't really have any Hebrew over here. I'm sorry. If you've got something in Hebrew in front of you, then I can pronounce it, but it probably won't
I
be a
should've-
word I know.
It's mishpat. It's mishpatim.
Right. See, Scott's given it a try. I wouldn't even have the courage to do that.
Try. He said try.
Um,
As if I
It's
was
not
off.
what
Actually,
when I
I did-
have the
I did know
guy
that
read
word.
it on my software. It didn't sound like that. So
He can be wrong.
it could be, but the tone of his voice really sounds like he knew what he was talking about.
Okay, it's probably mishpatim.
It's something closer to that.
It's a hard A.
But
Boom.
you work on that, Tyson.
All right, thank you.
It's a long, harder A.
The concept, as we joke and laugh about that, is we're seeing a word that is uniquely placed here as a marker to indicate this sort of ruling, ordinance.
That are based on the Ten Commandments
is
and applications
different
of
than
them.
what we would say the word, the commandment.
Yes.
Was given in chapter 20.
Sometimes you'll see rules, statutes.
Yes.
uh,
Ordinance.
Sometimes some other words like that. Yeah.
It's a rulings, so it's a hard word to translate because it's not just a static rule. It's like has an action mixed in with it. So it's a rulings.
Like it's a judgment
Yeah.
about practical things in their lives. Yeah.
Mhm.
In Deuteronomy 4, Moses says, the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and rules.
Mhm.
Same thing.
Yep.
Referring actually to the beginning here and following.
Yeah.
That you might do them in the land that you're going over to possess.
And it's an indicator of that transition that this is, as we talked about some previously, this is the practical application of how do we apply these moral principles, these commands that really cover the moral law. How do we apply that into my context that I'm living in day to day, which it gets us to that place of slavery was a very real part of their society and their world.
And just to piggyback off that a bit and nuance or make another point about that in that way is that the laws about altars from the last week and last episode is the first table of the law. It's the first 4. And this is the beginning of 5 through 10. So that's why it's more about their context, like you just said, and the application to them. Yeah.
And the interaction with people, which is really what that second table.
Yeah, vertical, horizontal. Cool.
One thought that I had early on was to help differentiate what is going on here that is called slavery and the slavery that we know because of our country's past is the main difference of stealing people to make them slaves versus like self-imposing slavery.
That's definitely a distinction, and there's some overlap that's
Yes.
a little wonky and difficult.
Sure.
But that's definitely a helpful distinction because man stealing is always talked about as a bad, wrong thing.
Right. Deuteronomy 24:7 says, if a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die.
Yes.
And so there's...
And that's sort of like I'm not exactly sure this is an absolute parallel, but it's pretty much the same thing. That's like saying a mercenary to go do that, and whether you're doing that with many or one,
Yeah.
it is always bad and wrong.
Yeah.
In the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
So that's distinguished from what we're talking about,
Right.
obviously, and that is not this.
Right.
Yes.
Right. This is different than that stealing, kidnapping, and then making a profit.
Right. This is also another helpful distinction in this regard. I mean, if we're going into it now. Is that fine with you, Tommy?
I mean, if
Are there other important things you want to say?
skipping forward.
I know. I knew
Well,
that.
we can back up. We can back up.
That's why I was asking.
But
'cause
I know it's the
I was
pressing
feeling
thing,
it.
and this is we want this to be for life group leaders, and we know
Yes.
the pressing thing everyone's going to want to talk about is that.
Yes.
Yeah.
We must discipline ourselves to work through the text in such a way that we start with the right foundation, which is partly why I would say let's press ourselves to do the foundational work, and then we can try and make a few practical thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay.
So do that for us, and we'll come
Yeah.
back to that.
So the marker of the transition, we talked about that with the word rules, and then there's some practical applications. We're going to see it broken down with that intro verse there, verse 1, and then we're going to see two sections primarily. So the male slave and then the female.
And that's 1 through 6 is male, and 8 through 11.
Mm-hmm. And underneath each one of those, you're going to have some clauses that are if this, then this should happen. And if this, which are just, here are some scenarios, not exhaustive. Here are some things. And so each one of those has 4 secondary rulings underneath the initial or primary ruling.
Yes, and the primary ruling thing is when da-da-da-da-da-da.
Yes, it
And
creates
then the rest are if this.
like a historical, this happened, when this happens,
Yeah.
here's the ruling. And then there are some secondary conditions under each one of those.
Yeah.
And so what we have structurally then, and so this is, Scott, as you were reading through this, you indicated this. Structurally, we have then a center point in this section in those verses 5 and 6. And so we said these are important. We're going to come back to those. Because that creates the center point of between those, which I'm going to draw the emphasis in that as we preach through this. It has some gospel pointers in that.
And we've alluded to this here and there on the podcast, I think at least a couple of few times. In generic terms, that's chiastic
Yes.
in the sense that, so a chiasmus is a Greek X, and then you're sort of taking the A, B, C, we'll say C is 5 and 6 here, and B prime and, or no, B prime and A prime. Yeah, so it's coming inward to a central thing that may be the main point or contrasted with the rest or things like that.
Yeah, this one doesn't work in the traditional chiasm structure,
Right.
but it does balance. We're used to seeing this for sure in the way that texts are arranged. And so,
Because the 5 and 6 come as a part of that if, but yes.
so we often will see the center point of that being the primary argument. In our sermons, the center point of our text, of our sermons are going to be some intro stuff, and then boom, the primary argument of what the text says.
Yeah.
We do this today too.
Yeah.
So that's how it's structured, and we're going to see there those 5 and 6, the uniqueness marked by the transitional. But if this happens, and then into verse 6, but then the second half there, the female slave. So there's a lot of things that you could work through, and we won't spend a ton of time just in the sermon talking about all of the historical context of what it looks like specifically for that. But I would say, Tyson, you were very right on point, as we would say, the economic structure of why would a male be in slavery in this context, and why would a female, your ESV study Bible is going to talk about the wedding cost associated with a female there. And so that's why we see in that second half some of the stuff where you're thinking slavery and you're like, wait a second, that looks like marital stuff. Well, yes, it is. And so the ESV study note there indicates that it's very much related to those marital costs and the marital structure.
Of, the costs of doing a wedding, like everyone had to do that in that culture. And if you couldn't afford that, then you had to do something like this, which is another way of speaking to that slavery issue in general terms, just while I'm on it and thinking about it. The economic circumstances of that day meant that people would often voluntarily do these kinds of things
Yes.
and put themselves into that economy of, I will be a servant / slave, same word, because I can't afford my own home or my own food, etc. And there were actually lots of other reasons too. So they would put themselves into that context, which is why it says things like "when you buy," which is again distinct from when you go as a mercenary and kidnap, and even because in some of those contexts we know from the history of slavery, they would go and buy slaves as mercenaries there too. So sometimes there are parallels where we think, oh, well, that's what? Why is that going on here? It's not the same thing.
Yeah.
So just to nuance some of that.
Yeah, and I think when we look at, hey, why are we leading this whole section of coming out of the commandments with got the altars and then slaves as leading? Like that's going to structurally, that's going to tell us something, and it does speak to that impulse we want to say for slavery makes us uncomfortable. But why are we leading with this? Well, because we're going to talk about that, I think, a little bit here in a moment.
By leading with it, you mean
it's in front
as we're
of all
getting
of it.
into this section of Exodus.
This section of Exodus. So we've got lots of other stuff that we're going to be going to, what happens when some other stuff goes on. But why are we leading here when culturally any other written law code at this time would have included stuff about slaves toward the end? And
like Hammurabi, etc.
Yes.
They all had stuff at the end like that because
the value was more of a value of property.
Yeah.
And so one of the things the Bible is doing here is saying in God's written codes here, as God says this, we want to be really clear what's the underlying value, that human life has value. And we only see, and you'll see this throughout history, that the cultures that get the value of human life are values that come out of the scriptural, from God, because God says it has value. When we're left to do it by man's way, and when we see the way that slavery is so prevalent throughout the world history, those are prevalent in a sense where we don't see the value of a person because we've missed that moral law of God.
That's a huge, very important point, I think, that the Bible is doing the opposite of all those cultural norms at the time. Yeah.
So
there's several places in Scripture where God will be talking about slavery and talking about these boundaries and guidelines that he wants to see happen. And he starts with, remember, you were a slave in Egypt.
Yes.
And so I took you out of that harshness, that horrendous version, and I'm making a better expectations here for you and your people.
Which I think is the second reason why it is leading here at this section. They had just come. And so they've come to the mountain, and we talked about this. Scott, you preached this sermon. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? And why are we headed this direction? Well, he's going to tell us at the mountain. Here's why. And so this is right there at that point. So it makes sense to say you were in this place of slavery. You know how it worked in Egypt. Here's how it's going to work for you. And it's going to work this way. As you interact second table with people, you are going to, and all of these things these specific examples are going to show that there's value in the human life. And that there is a way in which you can treat somebody not as a piece of property, but as recognizing they have dignity as made in the image of God. And
so what you've just said is, you all were, and I freed you, and here we are beginning to talk about how you interact with one another and the rest of the world. So you go do the same thing, is in a sense what we've just said about the contrast between the Bible putting that kind of stuff toward the beginning, because of course they had just come off of it, but it's also God saying, do this like I did this for you. Remember how I.
Right. We talked about this with when we talked through the Sabbath command and how no other culture on the face of the planet did that. Why would you stop working? And so God says to recognize something important about who I am. And there's a shadow of that even in the opening of this with the rhythm of 6 and 7. And so the serve 6 years and the seventh go free. And so there's a shadow of that Sabbath principle that undergirds this rhythm upon which God says, you live this way because it is out of the rhythm of how I created the world and who I am. And then
the Jubilee would be another larger version of that later. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, so that's a pretty good covering of the context that it falls. We certainly could get very granular with that. And if you want to in your groups, there's no end of resources for that in those specific examples.
Let's get into the
But,
text
yeah.
of it and make some points because we have
Because we're going to run out
10
of time.
minutes. Yes.
Do it.
So, lead us that way.
Oh, okay. Well,
Ready to go.
we can. So the male slave, it's going to talk about some of those dynamics that he comes in economically with.
Yes.
And so if this happens, this happens. And the interesting thing about the economic production is very much related to how many people do you have to labor. And so you say, like, if he has a wife and children, it's strange for us to think how that belongs to the master, but there's a provision given there that says, hey, you don't have to not bring your children and your wife and this point of being free. And so we have the recognition that, yeah, that's strange to us, but it's not a, hey, too bad you had kids, they're mine now. It's a, here's how this would work in a way. And so that leads us through that first section. And then we have, likewise, again, the passage with the daughter, if that happens, and typically this would have been a daughter given into a situation to be joined to a master as a wife.
Yeah.
And so that's why you have the, if she does not please the master, which is, we would read that and understand that in some form of marital fashion, then this is what's going to happen. Then it changes the structure just a bit. And secondly, if it wasn't a wife for the master, then it would be for the son. And so you see that there in verse 9. And if that happens, then you're going to treat her like a daughter because she is a daughter-in-law to you. You're going to treat her that way.
Which is the same kind of, as you have already pointed out a few times, the same kind of, I guess, progression of what happens with the male slave at the top, which is it goes toward caring for.
Yeah,
Let's
it
just say
does.
that.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
And then even as it closes up, it says, all right, and this is weird, yes, God does not condone polygamy.
Right. The presence of something in Scripture does not mean it's condoned.
Yeah, and we need to talk about that with slavery.
Yeah.
Just because it's here, does that mean God condones it? But so there in verse 10, it says, if he takes another wife, then don't do these things. List 3 things. Don't diminish her food, her clothing, her marital rights. And so it really indicates a sense of care and responsibility throughout that. No, the Bible doesn't condone polygamy. Yes, it was very much the case, especially as it was tied to the economic reality of any woman being unmarried, independent. Yeah,
It was also just survival.
society
Yeah.
was not set to be able to survive. It would
Right.
have meant certain doom or death.
And
Right.
we see in Scripture, which is progressive revelation, how basically polygamy just is not a thing, eventually. Even in
Right.
the Old Testament.
Yeah.
No matter what certain cults say today.
Yeah.
It's risky, maybe not Greenville, but it's risky in some places for women to go out and do something by themselves. Arguably at least more risky than for a male. And so that's just going to be further the case, even more the case here in this era. And so then we see some of these provisions and protections that look really strange to us.
Sure.
Yeah. I think it's worth saying the question at this point, because the Bible talks about slavery in this way, does that mean it condones it? And one of our commentators that we work through in this makes a great point when he says, would we say the same for murder? So the Bible's going to say when murder happens, do this. Would we say then because God gives rules about murder that he's condoning murder? Of course we would not. It's very clear that the Bible doesn't say, hey, murder's okay. And God gives rules for slavery. It does not mean that he then says, slavery is a great thing. Go do this. It says slavery is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as we want to think that today, that we are past that age, and for 100 plus easily years, if not more, the world, the whole modern Western world has wholly condemned slavery as a moral evil.
Theoretically, in our understanding of the Western world, yes.
Yes, it is as prevalent,
Socioculturally.
some say even more prevalent today than ever.
Just because of the size of our population and then the numbers of those who are.
So just
Involved.
saying, so in other words, people, if the Bible would just be real clear, this is a moral evil, and just say it flatly, then it would be done away with. Well, the Western world has very clearly said it is a moral evil, and rather than stamping it out, it has continued to increase. What
As
the
if,
Bible-
as if saying it's a moral evil will do away with it.
Right.
That's your
because
point.
what the Bible
Right.
makes really clear, we are sinners. And it says, how do I deal with sin and operate within that brokenness of
In
this
redemptive
society?
ways, like
In
this is
redemptive
really
ways
saying, yes.
that point to God,
Yes.
because that's the only solution for sin.
Which isn't an argument for saying it's okay to continue to do things that are sinful.
Absolutely.
Right.
Which is the point I hope we see so clearly in this, and that we would take when we come across uncomfortable passages about slavery, that it is not simply saying, God's cool with that.
Right. And I think it's also important to say, again, though we said it earlier, the slavery we're talking about here is the kind of economic reality that was needed at the time for some people, actually for a lot of people. And secondly, that much of what we're talking about, not entirely all of it, so there is some muddy difficulty here, but much of the, and I would say the overwhelming majority of what we're talking about here is people voluntarily putting themselves into that kind of servant-slave-master relationship for economic reality kinds of needs and purposes. So even just this passage right here is not a parallel to
Right.
what we're talking about with contemporary problems
Yeah. We think
and
ethnic
our
based,
history as a
yeah.
a country, or the history of actually most countries in the world.
We think chains, we think ethnicities,
Right.
and that is not comprehensive in the way that we think about this. One of the statements I'll be making in preaching through this is that all of us are in some way a slave.
Yeah.
Yeah. To support what you're both saying, it's not the exact same thing, but it's giving some more clarity to it. Leviticus 25:39 says, "If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you,"
Sells himself to.
et cetera, et cetera,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things to think about is, do you have people who function in this sort of a master-servant role in our society, and what principles might we draw out of that in terms of application?
Let's do that quickly because we have 2.5 minutes total.
So do you have employees? Do you run a business and you have employees?
Yeah. Everybody's under an authority.
Yeah, then we're under some form of, that's the one that I am serving to help their business grow. Well, so that master then should recognize you're not just a piece of property to deal with on a chessboard, that there's a value that you're bringing that should be recognized and honored and not taken to the point of exploitation. And I think that's a value that we can extend in lots of different scenarios. The Bible does that again in the way that it talks about if we owe a money debt, then we become a slave to the one that we have borrowed from. And so many people today have that relationship. And the Bible is real clear about passages, and Jesus even teaches parables of sorts where mercy is shown so that we might recognize we show mercy too in those circumstances. So there are a lot of parallels and applications we could make. That's the quick version.
Yeah. Let's talk about 5 and 6.
Yeah. 5 and
end
6.
up there.
Yeah, you've noticed some interesting grammar. Walk us through that.
So everything in the entire passage, as we've noted, is when this, if, and then at the bottom, when this, if. But the center, as you talked about earlier, the center is but. If the slave plainly says, and this is a weird thing, I love my master. So love is suddenly a part of this center thing.
Yes.
And it's the word but, which is the exception clause in a real explicit kind of way. It's an exception clause that's trying to say something big is going on here. And whereas every single use of the word slave in the entire passage is a noun, in verse 6 at the end, where it says, he shall be his slave forever, in the English, in the ESV at least, it says slave as if it's a noun, but it's not actually a noun at all. It's the only example in the entire passage that is a verbal, active, serving word So it's, he shall be the one who serves forever, which is also weird. Forever? So like, but then love is put in there, and then slave is used verbally in distinction with all the nouns. Forever?
And I cannot help but see in that moment the relationship we have to Christ.
Yeah.
We're
marked.
Yeah, we see in passages in Philippians 2 where Christ emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. He who had every right to all authority and to be worshipped took the form of a servant, that we might do likewise. And then what it says is when we die to ourselves, we are dying to all of the things that we might otherwise give our allegiance to, so that we can be a slave to Christ and not a slave to sin. That is salvation. And so I love the gospel pointer here, that we become marked for Christ, to be his forever. Why? Because I love my master.
Because we are slaves who have plainly said that.
Yeah, I love my master, Jesus Christ.
Yeah. It does point to that, and you'll be talking about that in the sermon, so that's great
Yeah.
stuff. All right, that was complicated.
It is. Yeah, if you have questions,
That was
then
good.
ask Tyson. He has all the answers.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.